This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Iroshizuku Murasaki-Shikibu. I'll test it in a variety of pins and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub. And I'm going to be featuring the Pilot Pereira with a Cursive medium nib. This might be the last writing sample that this pen is in. It might be going to a new home tomorrow. We shall see. All right. I'm going to start with the Pilot 78G Plus with an extra fine nib. And I'm writing on Tomoe River paper. I like this. Perfectly acceptable. And in fact, I'm going to label this one nice. No scratchiness to it. Not an unbearable amount of feedback. Very, very acceptable. Next, I've got a Pilot Pereira with a fine nib. Very smooth. I'm liking the way this ink looks in these first two nibs. Very legible in that extra fine. Sometimes the extra fine is just too fine with some inks, but this one's nice. And I would, what would I call this one? I would call that nice. Okay. Next, I've got Pilot Custom 74 with a fine nib, a 14 karat fine nib. You see it right slightly different than the Pereira. I would call this nice also. I think most people would not call that smooth. I call it smooth because I use fine and extra fine nibs on a regular basis. See how much wetter that is? And someone pointed out to me a few videos ago that their Custom 74 writes drier on the upstrokes and the right strokes. And yeah, that seems to be true with mine also. Okay, next I've got a Pilot 78G with a medium nib this time. This is very smooth. I like that. And I've got the Pilot Pereira with the Cursive medium nib. Now, normally this nib is not my favorite from an aesthetic perspective because the ink is a little too pale because it doesn't put down much ink. But this was very smooth. I'm going to go ahead and when you compare it to the others, it's not the paleness of it. It's not so much more pale that the ink looks different. It's very pleasant. The ink looks pleasant in this cursive medium nib. All right, and I've got a Nemesign Singularity with a 0.6 stub nib. I discovered today that Birmingham Pens has these Nemesign replacement nibs where you can buy just the individual nibs on the Birmingham Pens website. Okay, it's a little darker in this nib. It's putting down more ink. As usual, this nib is very pleasant. Very nice. I like that. And I discovered today I tried to put one of these 0.6 stub nibs into my Pen BBS 308, and those 308s, the cap is not long enough for a lot of the number 6 replacement nibs that you can get, and that was the case here. So this nib was too long for the Pen BBS 308. But someone mentioned in the comments, I think it was in the last video, that they put a 0.8 stub into a Pen BBS 345. I think that's the big vacuum filler, so that's good to know. This is my 1.5 stub nib that I've got in a Jinhao X750. This is nice. It looks like there's going to be some nice shading. All right, while that dries, and excuse my allergies, I'm sneezing my head off today. While that dries, I'm going to take a look at some other writing samples on other papers. This is my little ARC notebook, and I just liked the way all of these looked. Now, the extra fine was a little bit scratchy, but, you know, you could still get by writing little short notes with it. It wasn't the worst scratchiness I've ever experienced, but by the time I got to the fine nib was just very smooth. All right, let's see. And it's not wanting to really feather. This ink did on this poor quality paper. Look how quick it dried, most of them. Now the Custom 74 with the gold nib, it's putting down more ink, but the steel nibs, it just really soaked into the paper really fast, and it felt like, you know, you can feel the ink spreading. So I really liked the Pereira was my favorite on this paper because it puts down such a small amount of ink that it's not spreading. But so the ink soaked into the paper really quickly, but the only one that really bled through was the Custom 74 because it was putting down so much ink. Just bled through a little bit here at the beginning, and the big stub nib. So this performs pretty well on poor quality paper. On the Rhodia, all of the nibs felt good. Now, the extra fine felt nice, but it's just a little bit leaning toward illegible. It's so fine that it makes it not as pleasant to read back. My favorite was the Custom 74. I liked the Nemesign also, but really like that Custom 74 fine nib. All right, and on 20-pound copy paper, on this paper you could really feel the ink spreading out. The extra fine was scratchy. It looks good, and in fact, even with it being just a little bit scratchy, the extra fine and the Pereira were my favorites to use on this paper because look how quickly the ink just soaks into the paper. You don't get any smearing. But let's see. The two stub nibs, the 0.6 and the 1.5, and it looks like the Custom 74 bled through a little bit. So the extra fine and the Pereira were my favorites to use just because you didn't have that ink spreading. In my Leuchtturm, okay, I went through with the 1.5 nib and wrote, and it was just kind of flat. It was pretty, but when I did my ink smear, I was like, I don't have enough ink in this. So I do all these writing samples by dipping the nibs. So I dipped it again and got a good smear, and this is what it actually looks like. I'm not seeing a whole lot of shading. It's either pale, if your pen writes dry, it's either pale purple or a dark purple. You know, it's pretty either way, but didn't see any shading, a noticeable amount of shading. And on my Tomoe River paper, same thing here. It's just kind of flat. So I prefer the finer nibs with this. Now the extra fine was a little bit too fine, but the fine nib, both the steel and the Custom 74, I just really like those. The medium's okay if you like a wider nib, but my favorites were the steel and the gold fine nib, and I always like the Nemesign 0.6 stub. All right. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.